So despite how complicated the course gets at the end of the year, right, with crazy things like monopsony and factor markets and even things that we do a ton like perfect competition, everything goes back to the basics of supply and demand. So if you can really internalize those, you'll be setting yourself up for some good success on the AP exam. So to go way back to the basics for this third video, let's start by talking about the law of demand. And as a consumer, I want things. I want a lot of things, but my resources are limited. So if I'm going to buy something and the price is really high, I'm not going to want to buy a lot of that good. But if the price comes down, my demand, or more specifically, the quantity I demand goes up. So the law of demand says that when price comes down, the quantity demanded goes up. There's a change in your quantity demanded. It increases, right? We don't necessarily need that triangle there. On the other hand, if the price goes up, the quantity I demand goes down. So this is an inverse relationship between price and quantity. So if we were to graph this, which we do all the time, we're going to put price where? On the vertical axis, put quantity on the horizontal axis, and let's call this demand. And just very basically, as price is high at the beginning, we're not going to demand a huge amount, right? If price is high, we're going to demand a small amount. But if price comes down, our demand is going to go up, right? So let's say price comes down to here. That means we're going to have a higher demand. And if we were to measure all of those things and be able to connect the dots, we would have a demand curve. Now, importantly, if price is the only thing changing, that means we have movement along the demand curve. Right? This is key. This is something that they're going to ask you on the test. If price is the only thing that changes, you're going to move from point A to point B on the demand curve. You move along it. So if price comes down, you'll move along the demand curve from point A to point B. If price then were to go back up, you'd move along the demand curve from point B back to point A. Now, we all know that the demand curve can also shift. So there are 5 things that would shift the demand curve. So the first one is tastes. Let's say your taste for this good increases, meaning it's more preferential to society. It's the hot trend. Well, that would mean demand, let's label this D1 to show that there's going to be 2 demand curves. Demand would altogether shift, meaning at every price, we'd be selling more of the good. That's a demand shift, increase due to taste. Now the other 4 are number of consumers, right? If there's more consumers in the market, you're gonna have more demand. If all the consumers leave, you're gonna have less demand. The third one is prices of related goods. These are complements and substitutes, right? You need peanut butter and jelly together. You either have shoes or sandals. You can't use them both at the same time. Complements or substitutes. And as the price of one changes, it will affect the demand for the other one. The next one is your income. If you get really rich, you're going to buy more of normal goods and less of inferior goods. If you're on the poorer end of the income distribution, you're going to have more inferior goods that you want. Remember, inferior goods are things like cans of beans, while normal goods would be a big steak fillet. And then the last one is your future expectations. What do you expect price to do in the future? If you expect price to change in the future, that will affect how your demand changes right now. So if I expect prices to go down in a few months, well, then I'm going to wait to buy it until then. So maybe my demand will decrease in the short term. On the flip side from demand, we of course have supply. And supply is a harder perspective to internalize because you need to think of yourself as a producer. So if I'm producing something and the price that I get to sell my product for goes up, the price I get to sell my product for goes up, do I want to sell more or less of that product? I of course want to sell more of that product because I can make a bigger profit. Nothing has changed about my cost. We'll get to costs. But if the price of my product goes up, I'm going to want to supply more. Quantity will supply more. And if the price goes down, well, then I don't want to make as much of my good. I want to supply less of it. So in this case, let's start at a low point on what will become our supply curve. At a low price, we don't want to make a lot. But what if the price goes up? Well, if the price goes up, we're going to want to produce more of that good. So we're going to have an upward sloping supply curve. So let's call this point C and point D. When price went up, we moved along the supply curve. Again, movement along from points D to point C. Now, just like with demand, supply curve can shift as well. And in this case, there's actually 6 shifters. The biggest one is the price of inputs. Let's say I'm making, let's say I'm making baseballs. And I need the red stitching to make the baseballs. But let's say there's a huge shortage of that, so I can't get enough of it and it goes up in price. Well, if I can't get my input because it's so expensive, I'm going to supply altogether less of my good. A shift of supply to the left. In both demand and supply, decreases in demand and decreases in supply are shifts to the left, right? So other shifters are number of sellers. If my product becomes more popular, there'll be more sellers, and so that will increase supply. Next one is technology. Let's say it becomes easier to make my product because I have more technology. Now I'm going to be able to make more of it. The fourth one is government action. And there's 2 main types of government action that we're going to talk about in this course. Remember, they're taxes, per unit taxes, and subsidies, per unit subsidies. What is the government doing in terms of taxing me or giving me money that's going to impact the way I make my good? The next one is other goods. Most companies don't just make one product. So if I'm making baseballs, but it's the middle of the winter, I'm going to probably not make my baseballs. I'm probably going to switch to making one that was more profitable. I might switch to making basketballs or another indoor sport. And that leads to the last one, which is, again, future expectations. I'm only going to produce when I know I have a strong opportunity to actually sell my product for the price I want to sell it for. So if I have other goods and future expectations, those two kind of combine themselves to give you an understanding of when you're going to supply. Now, next, we're going to put these together. We're going to mix supply and demand. We're going to find that equilibrium point, and that becomes the central, allocatively efficient point that leads to all the more complicated graphs we're going to get to later in the course.